Every year, billions of people around the world perform a ritual as old as civilization itself. They calculate their earnings, fill out forms, and send a portion of their hard-earned money to the government. Some do it willingly, others resentfully, but almost everyone does it. We call it taxation, and it's one of the most universal yet controversial practices in human history. But have you ever wondered why? Why did humans, who once lived in small tribes sharing everything freely, eventually create systems where authority figures demanded a cut of everyone's wealth? What was the very first tax? Who collected it? And more importantly, who had the audacity to ask for it in the first place? The story of taxation doesn't begin with modern governments or even medieval kingdoms. It begins over 5,000 years ago, in the cradle of civilization, where the first cities rose from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. And the reason governments started collecting money is far more fascinating and complex than you might imagine. To understand why taxes exist, we first need to understand what life was like before them. For most of human history, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in small nomadic bands. 20, maybe 50 people moving together, hunting animals, gathering plants, and sharing everything they found. In these societies, there was no such thing as taxation, because there was barely such a thing as property. When a hunter killed a large animal, he didn't hoard the meat. He couldn't. There was no refrigeration, no way to preserve it. So he shared it with the group, knowing that when someone else made a kill, they would share with him. Anthropologists call this a gift economy, a system based on reciprocity rather than exchange. But around 10,000 years ago, everything changed. Humans discovered agriculture. In the Fertile Crescent, that lush arc of land stretching from modern-day Iraq to Egypt, people learned to plant seeds, cultivate crops, and domesticate animals. For the first time in human history, we could produce more food than we immediately needed. We could store surplus. And with surplus came something revolutionary: permanent settlements. Villages grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. And as population swelled, the simple gift economy of the hunter-gatherers could no longer function. You couldn't personally know everyone in a city of 10,000 people. You couldn't track who owed what favors to whom. By 4000 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, the world's first true cities emerged. Uruk, perhaps the greatest of them all, housed as many as 50,000 people behind its massive walls. These weren't just big villages. They were complex societies with specialized workers: farmers, potters, weavers, metalworkers, priests, and soldiers. Each person depended on others they would never meet. And at the center of each city stood a massive temple, a ziggurat reaching toward the heavens, dedicated to the city's patron god. These temples weren't just places of worship. They were the first corporations, the first governments, the first institutions that would demand the world's first taxes. In ancient Sumer, religion and government were inseparable. The priests who served the gods weren't just spiritual leaders. They were administrators, accountants, and ultimately, the world's first tax collectors. But they didn't call it taxation. They called it tribute to the gods. Here's how it worked. The Sumerians believed that the land itself belonged to the gods. Every field, every flock, every crop grown in the earth was divine property. Humans were merely tenants, caretakers of the god's estate. And like any landlord, the gods expected rent. Each year, typically after the harvest, farmers were required to bring a portion of their crops to the temple. Usually around 10%, though this varied by city and circumstance. The priests meticulously recorded every contribution on clay tablets, using the world's first writing system, cuneiform, which was invented precisely for this purpose, to keep track of who paid what. One tablet from around 3100 BCE, discovered in the ancient city of Uruk, reads, 7 measures of barley received from farmer Kushim. This may be the oldest known written record of a person's name in human history, and it's on a tax receipt. The very first words humanity wrote weren't poetry or prayers. They were accounting records. But here's what's crucial to understand. In these early systems, taxation wasn't pure exploitation. The temples didn't just hoard the grain, they redistributed it. They paid workers who built irrigation canals. They fed craftsmen who made tools and pottery. They supported priests who maintained the religious calendar that told farmers when to plant and harvest. They stockpiled grain for times of famine. In essence, the temples were providing services. They organized large-scale irrigation projects that individual farmers couldn't accomplish alone. They maintained order. They resolved disputes. They provided a social safety net. The tribute to the gods was, in practice, the price of civilization itself. This model spread. In Egypt, the pharaoh claimed divine status, and taxation flowed directly to him. Farmers paid in grain, which filled massive state granaries. Craftsmen paid in goods. Workers could pay in labor, spending months building pyramids or temples as their tax obligation. In China's early dynasties, similar systems emerged independently. Everywhere civilization arose, taxation followed close behind. For thousands of years, taxes were paid in kind: grain, livestock, cloth, or labor. But as civilizations grew more complex and trade expanded, this system became unwieldy. How do you pay a soldier stationed far from farmland? How do you calculate the tax value of a potter versus a blacksmith versus a farmer? Around 600 BCE, in the Kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, someone had a revolutionary idea: standardized metal coins. These weren't the first metal used as money, but they were the first coins stamped with official seals, guaranteeing their weight and purity. And almost immediately, governments recognized their potential for taxation. When the Persian Empire conquered Lydia and adopted coinage, they transformed taxation across their vast realm. The Persian king Darius I divided his empire into provinces called satrapies, and each satrap had to send a fixed amount of silver to the royal treasury at Persepolis every year. To get that silver, they taxed their populations. For the first time, people weren't just paying taxes in the goods they produced. They had to earn money specifically to pay taxes. This fundamentally changed the relationship between people and government. When you paid taxes in grain, you gave up what you directly produced. But when you paid in coins, you first had to sell your goods for money, which meant participating in markets, which meant accepting prices, which meant your relationship to your own labor became abstracted. Taxation and money helped create what we now call an economy. The Romans perfected this system with ruthless efficiency. They didn't directly collect most taxes. Instead, they auctioned off the right to collect taxes to private contractors called publicani. These tax farmers, as they were known, paid the government a fixed sum up front, then collected as much as they could from the population, keeping the difference as profit. This is why tax collectors were so hated in the Roman world. They're the villains in countless ancient sources. In the Christian Gospels, tax collectors are mentioned alongside sinners and prostitutes as society's most despised members. They were seen as traitors, collaborators who got rich by squeezing their own people on behalf of foreign conquerors, and people fought back. The Jewish revolt of 66 CE, which ended with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, began partly as a tax rebellion. Boudicca's uprising against Rome and Britain was triggered by excessive taxation. The list goes on and on. Throughout history, few things have sparked more violence than the demand for taxes. So why did governments keep taxing, despite the resentment it caused? The simple answer is war. Throughout most of history, the primary expense of any government was its military. Armies had to be fed, equipped, and paid. Fortifications had to be built. Navies had to be maintained. In ancient times, armies were often seasonal. Farmers would fight during the off-season and return to their fields for planting and harvest. But as warfare became more sophisticated, states needed professional soldiers. And professional soldiers needed steady pay, which required steady taxation. In medieval Europe, this led to the feudal system, where taxation took the form of land relationships. Peasants worked land owned by lords and gave up a portion of their harvest. Lords owed military service to kings. Everyone owed something to someone above them, all the way up to the monarch at the top. It was taxation by hierarchy, but medieval kings constantly needed more money, especially for wars. And they couldn't just take it. Feudal contracts were binding. If a king wanted extraordinary taxation, he had to ask permission. In England, this led to the development of Parliament. In France, the Estates General. The principle of no taxation without representation emerged not from democracy, but from powerful nobles refusing to pay unless they had a say. By the early modern period, taxation had become the lifeblood of state power. The kingdoms that could tax effectively could afford better armies, better administration, better infrastructure. They won wars and expanded. Those that couldn't collapsed. Taxation became existential. But taxes didn't just fund wars. As states matured, they began providing more services. Roads that facilitated trade, courts that settled disputes, harbors that protected merchants, systems of weights and measures that made commerce possible. In Renaissance Italian city-states, taxes funded art, architecture, and public festivals that enhanced civic pride and attracted trade. Gradually, a new idea emerged, the social contract. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke argued that people consented to be governed and to pay taxes in exchange for protection and order. Taxation wasn't divine tribute or feudal obligation. It was a deal, a bargain between citizens and state. The Industrial Revolution transformed taxation yet again. As economies exploded in complexity, governments could no longer simply tax land and trade. They needed to tax income, profits, and consumption. In 1799, Britain introduced the world's first modern income tax to fund the Napoleonic Wars. It was supposed to be temporary. It wasn't. Once governments discovered they could tax income directly, they never went back. By the early 20th century, most industrialized nations had implemented income taxes. The percentage started low, often just a few percent on the very wealthy. But wars pushed rates higher. During World War II, top income tax rates in the United States exceeded 90%. But something else happened in the 20th century. Governments began providing far more services. Public education became universal. Healthcare systems emerged. Social security and pension programs were created. Infrastructure expanded massively. Taxation was no longer primarily about war. It was about building modern societies. The Scandinavian countries pioneered the modern welfare state, with tax rates among the highest in the world, but also some of the most comprehensive public services. Citizens paid heavy taxes but received free education, health care, generous parental leave, and extensive social support. The social contract had evolved into something the ancient Sumerians could never have imagined. Of course, where there are taxes, there's tax avoidance. Throughout history, the wealthy and powerful have found ways to minimize their obligations. In medieval times, they claimed clerical status to avoid taxes. Today, they use offshore accounts and complicated corporate structures. The game of cat and mouse between tax collectors and tax avoiders is as old as taxation itself. Today, virtually every country on Earth has a tax system, though they vary wildly. Some nations rely heavily on income taxes. Others use consumption taxes like VAT. Some tax wealth, others tax land or natural resources. Oil-rich nations sometimes barely tax their citizens at all, funding government from resource revenues instead. But beneath all the numbers and percentages lies a fundamental question that has never been fully resolved. What gives government the right to take our money? The ancient Sumerians believed the gods owned everything and humans paid tribute. Medieval lords claimed ownership of land by conquest. Modern democracies argue that citizens collectively decide to tax themselves. Different political philosophies give different answers. Libertarians argue that taxation is coercion, morally equivalent to theft. justified only for the minimal functions of defense and law enforcement. Socialists argue that taxation is how society reclaims collectively created wealth from private hands. Moderates see it as a practical necessity, the price we pay for civilization. Throughout history, disputes over taxation have toppled governments. The American Revolution began with the slogan, "No taxation without representation," though in truth, the colonies were among the most lightly taxed places in the world. The French Revolution was triggered partly by an unfair tax system, where nobles and clergy were exempt while peasants bore the burden. And the debate continues today. How much should we tax? Who should pay more? What should taxes fund? Should they redistribute wealth or simply fund basic services? Should corporations pay more or less? What about international companies that operate everywhere but pay taxes nowhere? These questions are becoming more complicated as economies digitize. How do you tax cryptocurrency? What about income earned in virtual worlds? What happens when automation replaces human workers and traditional income disappears? The future of taxation might look as different from today as today looks from ancient Sumer. So why did governments start collecting money? The answer is layered and complex. It began with temples organizing agriculture and redistributing surplus in humanity's first cities. It evolved as states needed resources for defense, administration, and public works. It transformed with the invention of money, which abstracted the relationship between work and value. It expanded as democracies emerged and citizens demanded services in exchange for their taxes. Today, taxation is how we collectively fund the infrastructure of modern life. The roads we drive on, the schools that educate our children, the courts that settle our disputes, the police and firefighters who protect us, the researchers who advance medicine and technology, the safety nets that catch us when we fall. That clay tablet from ancient Uruk, recording 7 measures of barley from farmer Kushim, was the beginning of a practice that would shape civilization. Taxation built the pyramids and the highways. It funded the armies that drew borders and the scholars who pushed them forward. It raised cathedrals and sent humans to the moon. Is taxation theft, as some claim? Or is it the foundation of society, as others insist? Perhaps it's both, or neither. Perhaps it's simply what happens when humans try to live together in large numbers, pooling resources to accomplish what no individual could alone. It's the price of being part of something larger than ourselves. 5,000 years ago, in the dusty cities of Mesopotamia, priests collected grain in the name of the gods. Today, accountants process forms in the name of the state. The tools have changed, the justifications have evolved, but the basic bargain remains. We give up a portion of what we have, so that together we can build something greater. The origin of taxes is the origin of civilization itself. For better or worse, it's how humans learn to cooperate at scale, to plan for the future, and to create the complex societies we inhabit today. Every time you pay taxes, you're participating in a ritual that stretches back to the very dawn of recorded history, connecting you to every civilization that has ever existed. That's the fascinating origin of taxes. If this documentary opened your eyes to how deeply taxation shaped human civilization, share this video with someone who complains about tax season. Give it a like if you learned something new, and subscribe to the Fascinating Origins of Things for more deep dives into the surprising stories behind everyday aspects of our world. Because every modern practice has an ancient beginning, and every question about why things are the way they are leads to a story worth telling.